I've been looking for a place that I'd rather be. I've been searching for my own destiny. I raise my gun to the sky and scream out loud. This is my life, this is my hope, this is what I stand for. Now it's the time to let it all. We are the young ones that fight for survival. We will watch it like an eye on the fire. We are the young ones that fight for survival. We will watch it like an eye on the fire.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome. My name is Jennifer Peck from the Partnership for Children and Youth, and welcome to the first of our webinar series that we are calling Summer Game Plan to get information and resources out to school and community-based educators all around the state of California as we prepare for this coming summer and figure out the best ways to support young people given the extremely challenging year that we have had. There are obviously a lot of challenges to planning for summer this year, but there's also a lot of opportunity given increased public resources that we'll have at our disposal, as well as an opportunity to be really creative in how we are designing programs, how we are expanding partnerships, and how we're providing spaces for recovery and restoration this summer for children and also for adults. The Partnership for Children and Youth has been really invested in summer learning for many years because we really believe that our ability to provide high quality, engaging summer experiences to young people is an extremely important piece of the puzzle when it comes to achieving equity in our system. And one thing I really want to say up front that I think is critical is that we stop talking about summer school and we start talking about summer learning. They have very different connotations. Summer school, which is what we used to do in the education system, was remedial and punitive and really didn't work. Summer learning is a different frame in which we can think about how to use the summer space to engage kids in learning in ways that broaden their horizons, expose them to new experiences and people and skills, and have fun, which is something we should not underestimate, especially in this particular year. So I'm going to pause for a moment and show a short video we made during our Summer Matters campaign several years ago that gives you a flavor of what I'm talking about.
Summer learning loss is holding back low-income students, who can lose as much as 2 to 3 months of learning during the summer if they don't have access to enriching activities and programs.
If that goes on year after year after year, by the time our students end up in 5th grade, they can be behind as much as 2.5 years, even though they are learning well during the school year.
Traditionally, remedial summer school has been the fallback option for districts hoping to address this academic achievement gap. But it often feels punitive, leaving students demoralized and no better prepared for the school year.
Traditional summer school, it's really that drill and kill. It's a remedial summer school program where they're filling in basic skills and students are required to attend, so that really dampers that motivation factor.
Our summer program takes a different view, and we try to make it fun for the students through different curricular activities. We are still academic, but it's looking at the program in a different way because it's motivating the students. It's for all students.
More and more school districts are getting inspired to offer high-quality summer programs that provide engaging academic experiences, include a blend of academics and enrichment that are designed to build skills, foster collaboration between students of all skill levels, promote healthy habits, and last a full day for at least a month.
When you talk about 21st century learning skills, it's communicating, it's critical thinking, it's all the additional skills that students are going to need to be successful in the 21st century. So the students are benefiting from a tremendously rich program. Our teachers are benefiting because they have a lab-like opportunity to practice those skills for the school year.
We find that students who have attended a summer program actually engage in conversations, they're risk takers, they raise their hand more often, they have that confidence.
Every year we do just a little more. There are many ways of turning a traditional summer school into summer learning with not a lot of extra resources needed. It just takes a little imagination and a lot of willpower and willingness to take a look at what you can do.
Take a look at what you can do to leverage the unique opportunity that local control funding provides your school district to build high-quality summer learning programs.
So before we get started with our panel, I just want to do a quick reminder that this webinar is part of a series, and we have a few topics lined up as you see here. We want to do a piece on summer staffing, which we know is on a lot of people's minds for this year. We're going to do one on supporting English learners. We want to place some focus on high school youth who are also going to have a lot of needs this summer in addition to our younger kids. At the very end of our webinar, we're going to ask you a few questions about content areas you'd like to see covered in this series. So please stick around until the end so we can get your feedback. So we wanted to launch this with some of the foundational pieces of summer planning, which include what we know works in summer from the research and implications for planning and practice, and also policy and funding. What kind of resources will communities have for summer programs this year? What will the priorities and the guidelines be for those resources to help inform our planning? We're very lucky to have some great experts with us today on these topics. And we're going to start with a conversation with Dr. Jennifer McCombs, who is a senior researcher with the RAND Corporation and is a co-author of the recently published report called Getting to Work on Summer Learning. And Jennifer is a deep expert in the literature on what it takes to promote learning and well-being for students in the summertime. So Jennifer, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. We really, really appreciate your time. And I want to start with kind of an overview question for you, which is, how long have you been studying summer learning, and what was the significance of the recently published Getting to Work on Summer Learning report that you co-authored?
Sure. So I've been studying summer learning for about a decade now. So it's been a while, and I've done it in a few ways in terms of understanding the SCAN and summer learning loss. I've conducted evidence reviews of summer learning programs very broadly. But the bulk of my knowledge comes from running the Longitudinal National Summer Learning Project, where we were examining summer learning programs across 5 districts at scale. And the study was unique in that it was an incredibly rigorous study. It includes a randomized controlled trial, but it was particularly helpful in the depth of implementation data that we gathered through the study. So we studied implementation for 4 years, And in 2 of those years, we conducted extensive observations of classes. So we followed each classroom of youth in the study. There are over 6,000 kids in our study for their entire day. And so we have a lot of knowledge about how districts and their partners develop these programs, how students experience programs, and the factors and conditions that can lead to success. And that culminated in sort of a practice guide for districts, community partners, and the like interested in developing academic summer learning programs, which is the Getting to Work on Summer Learning.
Got
It
it.
provides just very practical guidance on this. And I think it's one of the things that's most heartening to me as a researcher, because I do this work so that it can be utilized. And I think this is one of the most accessible things and most helpful things that I've ever produced in my career.
Thank you. And one thing I forgot to say before we started with Jennifer is that rather than doing Q&A at the end of each of these presentations, we want for folks to post your questions in the chat, and we will be monitoring that and weaving in your questions throughout our time with each of the panelists. So please put your questions in the chat box, and we will be sure to address them as we're going through. And if we run out of time, we're going to keep note of the questions so that we can respond to them after the fact, and we'll follow up with you. So my next question for you, Jennifer, is in the guidance that you developed from the study for practitioners, a lot of focus is placed on planning. And what did you find to be the most important factors to consider as folks are planning for their summer programs?
Right. So planning is really critical to, it really is the backbone and support structure for the entire program. And as districts and partners and community-based organizations are thinking about the summer, and when time is tight, you have to think about sort of like how you prioritize your planning and what's most important to plan for. And I would say that I would really recommend starting with understanding who the students are that you want to be serving and what their needs are, because that is the basis for which you're going to develop intentional programming. So you want what you are doing in terms of the curriculum, which includes academics and enrichment activities, the staffing structure that you have, the amount of time that you're going to be spending, all flows from that. Sort of like who you want to serve, how you align those things, and then how you want to recruit and engage students. And thinking about engaging and ensuring strong attendance sort of like across the program also really requires a focus on the culture of the site. And so when I was watching the video, it just reminded me of the importance of that. You can see like one of the things that's compelling about that, and it's compelling about some of these summer learning programs, is that they're fun and engaging for kids. And to do that, sort of you have to have the logistics behind that have to be pretty smooth. Adults have to know what to be doing and have to be staffed and prepared to do that. And then, of course, the activities themselves have to be engaging and worthwhile for kids.
Thank you. Around recruiting students and keeping them engaged and attending consistently, that's always a challenge in summer because programs are voluntary. But in this particular year, I think a potentially very daunting challenge, given that families may be nervous about bringing kids back after this year of COVID, and I think there's going to be some special challenges around that. But we also know consistent attendance is really one of the most critical things to the success of these programs. And what are some of the things that you've learned from your research about attendance and engagement that are going to be especially important to pay attention to for this particular summer?
So, I mean, it sounds like this no-brainer when we think about it. It's like kids have to attend to benefit from the programs, but they really do have to attend regularly, and they have to attend a lot to be able to have demonstrable shifts in academic performance. Some things that districts have done is think really intentionally about the recruitment materials and their strategies. You want to be able to talk about in those materials sort of like why the program is important and it's going to be fun and worth time, but two, the importance of attending in order to reap the benefits of it. There are some things that we can focus on that will help attract families and may reduce some of the trepidation about COVID, actually, which is the fact that these programs tend to have small class sizes. They often are engaging kids outdoors, sort of like there's a lot of outdoor activity and things like that. So you can be thinking about how to put that into your recruitment materials. It's also worth thinking about how to leverage community-based partners that already have existing relationships. So thinking about teachers who know students and community-based partners who know students that you particularly want to reach. One of the things that we found is that sort of like these trusted messengers are really important in helping gain family and kid buy-in into the programming. But then once kids are there, it's really important that they have a positive experience. And that means that from the beginning, you have to have sort of like your logistics relatively smooth so that when kids arrive that first day, people know what to do, parents know what to do, they know how kids are getting to the program, et cetera. That's pretty easy and seamless. But also the kids are having a fun and engaging time, that they want to go back, because that is the most critical piece. Because particularly during summer for voluntary programs, kids can vote with their feet to some extent. And if they're not having fun, they're not engaged, they're bored, they don't have friends, parents are less likely to bring them back.
Right. One thing I just want to mention to participants here is I know we have a lot of practitioners in the audience who may have really important things to share about some of the things we're covering here. And so if you do, please put them in the chat. We really want to collect your ideas and experiences as well. So I just wanted to mention that. So as you referenced, programs being fun and a place where kids want to be is a key factor in strong attendance. And I'm curious what specifically you learned from the research on the importance of enrichment. And one quick thing I want to say about this, before you answer is that, enrichment and building programs around student interests is always important in summer programs. And it's one of the things I love about the research. It really seems to reinforce the importance of that. But in this particular year, when there's a combination, I think, of pressure from some camps around addressing learning loss and academic needs that kids are going to have, that matched or in tension or conflict potentially with the absolute need to focus on social emotional well-being of young people and the critical importance of really starting with providing safe, supportive, caring environments with caring adults being sort of the ultimate priority this year. So I wonder if you could just address that a little bit, and again, connecting it back to what you've learned from the research.
So I think you're right to highlight this, Jennifer, because there are lots of things that kids are missing out on right now. There are a lot of losses, and one of them is the loss of opportunity. Right. So there are kids who aren't engaged in after school, who haven't been, necessarily doing sports, who haven't had the social interaction with peers. They've lost a lot, not just sort of the academic content. And summer is a space where we can help fill those gaps. One of the nice things about enrichment in our study is that it was intentionally designed to help fill those gaps. We know that students from families with lower incomes often have less opportunity for programming during the summer months. And these types of programs provided a lot of different opportunities that they wouldn't have access to. Things like archery, swimming, boating, even different like arts and crafts, bicycle building. Like there are all sorts of things that enrichment providers were able to bring into these programs for students. And so I think that they're important just in the fact that they're providing children different opportunities to explore skills and interests, which I think is important and valuable in and of itself. It also has had the added benefit of making programs, one, feel like camp and not like a mandatory summer school that's more remediation focused. And it helps drive attendance. So it helps kids want to go to those programs. And when we conducted some research with parents too, and they were asking sort of like what they wanted for their children during those summer months, there was a focus on sort of having the opportunity to explore, to have fun, to have access to different opportunities, as well as to advance academic skills. And these types of programs can advance both of those needs. They don't need to be in conflict with one another. I find them to actually be very complementary and reinforcing in lots of ways.
Right. So I know from your study and the practice implications that the recommendation is that full day summer programs have this blend of certified teachers, doing the quote academic part of the program and community-based partners providing the enrichment and some of the other opportunities in the program. And that's sort of the ideal model around blended staffing to get to the kind of outcomes that we're looking for. But people are very concerned about staffing for this coming summer, and teachers are fatigued and may not want to work this summer. We're hearing a lot of that around the state. And on top of it, it appears that teacher retirements are rapidly rising because of the fatigue from this past year. And we have a lot of great community-based organizations and other partners who can play important roles in staffing summer programming. But can we find enough people across the board? At a minimum, we're going to have to be very creative, I think, around how we're staffing summer programs. And so, we've been thinking a lot about how can we draw on our college and even high school students this summer. What can you share about staffing approaches that you've seen to help people think about creative ways to staff programs this summer?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot as I've been talking to people and the concerns about the constraints that they faced. So in our study, sort of the recommendations that fall out of that is that, yes, small class sizes, and for the academic content taught by certified teachers, preferably with grade level experience. So that is like the gold standard. But recognizing that that might not be possible in all cases for this year. And so I think it's worth thinking about other types of models that might be used and how to think about that. And then also thinking about the supports and structures that are going to be needed to help train people, depending on what your staffing structure is going to be. And so you can think about, and then also thinking about different sources. So you brought up sort of like college students and high school students and how can we be leveraging them? I think that there are also different ways of thinking about how could we like dip into retirement pools of teachers to get them to come and teach summer programs. People who had taught before, that's another possible pool of teaching staff. I would say that, so there are some different models that I've seen in different summer programs. So like Collaborative Breakthrough has a model where they have college students working with around using a very specified curriculum with small groups of students who are then coached by teachers. So they receive sort of like a lot of support and training from a certified teacher to be able to enact instruction. So you can think about whether like, do you have access to colleges of education who might be able to provide students who might even have some teaching experience from their practicum, right? And have some different types of experience. And they might be able to handle some small groups of students. When you're thinking about high school students, I think it's also worth thinking about how they can help support enrichment activities, how they can be utilized for classroom aids. I do think that there's like a big need also. One of the things we know from the summer literature is that youth employment programs are highly effective. And that is a great need for our youth right now, right? So youth employment opportunities have been severely curtailed due to COVID. So how can we think about incorporating that type of labor force into our summer programming? And I think that we can also think about even different models of summer learning programs. If you're not able to have a teacher who has, one of the nice things about teachers is that they have experience teaching groups of students, which is much more difficult than working one-on-one. So if you have a model where you can't have, certified teacher in all cases, thinking about also models like, could you be utilizing like high dosage tutoring? Could you be getting sort of like a high school or a college student sort of like with a curriculum with specific supports to be working with groups of like 2 or 3 kids for like an hour and a half, starting to think about like the different types of models that you could be incorporating, because the high dosage tutoring has also been found to be very effective. And doesn't require the amount of skill in managing and teaching groups of students, which is like a different level of skill. So I think that there are places where we can think about like what's our available labor force, and what does that imply for what types of models that we should be utilizing for how we're going to be providing academic support. And then also, what is the training and support that they are going to need? So the more that you're relying on the folks who are having less experience in managing groups of and teaching groups of kids, the more expert support and training that they are going to need to be able to be successful. And I'm also going to add something, I'm going to put in a plug for something else, because one of the things that I've heard repeatedly is a lot of concerns that kids are going to be coming back with much more trauma, that we're going to be seeing higher rates of trauma among children and youth from this period of time due to COVID. And I think it's worth thinking about what that means for staffing a program, and what it means for also training anyone who's going to be interacting with those students, because very often when kids have experienced trauma, it gets demonstrated in terms of a behavior issue, but actually needs to be managed differently than a behavior issue. And so thinking about what types of individuals you are going to need to be able to help support those types of issues if we're expecting them, and what types of training that we need to be providing to anybody who's working directly with the kids, so that they're able to recognize who might need additional support.
So I'm gonna blend 2 questions that I saw come in. One was about, have you seen models of using pre-service teachers as part of their credentialing program? And connected to that is there a way for them to get credits toward their teacher credential by working in a summer program? Have you seen examples of that?
So I have seen sort of like, there are programs that have used sort of like those pre-credentialed teachers to be able to teach and be overseen by sort of like a coach level teacher who's working to support a group of these individuals working directly with students. What I don't know is whether they've worked out agreements on whether that counts for a pre-service teaching experience, but I think it's worth investigating and pursuing. So if you are somebody who has a partnership with a local College of Education, really talking to them now about how to think about that. Very often it requires, those pre-teaching experiences require a level of supervision from existing teachers, but thinking about how they could be gaining that experience, how they could be utilized in summer programs would be helpful. People may be also facing a backlog of those teachers themselves. Like, this could help relieve a problem in colleges of education too. I know this has been a problem for nursing programs where we haven't been able to necessarily get people into clinical rotations as often due to COVID restrictions. That may be the case in some communities with teacher colleges as well.
Right.
And this could be a mechanism of helping both parts of the system achieve their goals.
Right. I noticed that a couple people put some stuff in the chat about things they're doing in this regard, which is fabulous. So keep that input coming, because we want to follow up with you and pick your brain. So I think we have time for one more question, and the one I'm going to pose, because I think this is an imminent issue for people, is what are some of the strategies you have found most important around staff recruitment for the summer? For teachers or other staff who may be reluctant to work in the summer, what are some of the things that have worked in that regard?
So one is the benefit for students, right? Because basically you're trying to attract people who are in this field because they want to help children grow and develop and learn. And being able to specify and talk about sort of like what the benefits of the program are to children really does help with that. A second piece is direct outreach from somebody who's running the program. So if, for instance, you have a school-based program and getting the principal to reach out directly to the teachers that she most wants to teach in the summer program, that is actually highly effective in helping motivate people to do this. Another is to talk about some of the benefits. There are lots of reasons why teachers actually enjoyed working in the summer programs that go beyond just, additional income. And one is the fact that you have small class sizes. Like, teachers love that. A second is I would highlight the fact that you are going to provide a curriculum. This is the one time that teachers do not want to be developing their own curriculum. They simply don't have the time to do it. People don't fund it, but make them know that it's going to be easy for them. They're going to get the training, sort of like that it would be easy for them to walk in to do it, and they won't have to spend a lot of additional time on their own to do it. Departmentalization, and so that they're only teaching sort of like specializing in English language arts, for instance. You only have to one curriculum to be able to teach. That has also been attractive. And half days. So you can come and work half a day, sort of like kids will get a full day, but you only have to be there for part of the time. That's also been attractive. And the fact that, and giving them some sort of assurance that the program is well organized, right? What people, particularly right now due to COVID, where there's been so much back and forth just naturally, I think part of the burnout is just in terms of having to constantly be changing and something new being thrown at you and having to adjust. Right. And they're not going to be wanting to walk into that in a summer program. Right. But if you can convince them that it's well planned, well organized, it's going to be easy for them to step in. The logistics are going to be smooth, that it's going to be easy for them and a positive experience, you're going to be more likely to draw people in. And I think that's kind of people across the board, whether they're enrichment providers, whether they're teachers. The level of sort of like uncertainty and chaos that people have been facing lately, I think is partially related to the fatigue we're all feeling.
Yeah. Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this part of the program, but Jennifer, once again, we really, really appreciate you spending time with us, and we're going to continue bringing you back as much as we can to learn from all of the research that you've done around the nation over so many years around summer learning. One final thing I want to say on some of what we talked about a moment ago on the staffing piece, just to repeat something I said before, is I think we can employ a lot of strategies around trying to bring in educators to work in these programs. And it's an opportunity to be really creative around who we are collaborating with this coming summer, with our city park and rec agencies, with our housing organizations. I see that we have some of our affordable housing partners on the webinar today. Affordable housing organizations in many cases run after school and summer programming for young people and really want to be a part of the solution. So I'm encouraging everybody to open up their minds around those kinds of partnerships this year. So thank you, Jennifer. And we are going to transition to our next part of the panel around policy and funding, which I know is on everybody's minds. So we are really lucky to have with us this morning Edgar Zazueta from the Association of California School Administrators. Edgar runs state and federal governmental relations, so he is the perfect speaker for us today. He has been intimately tracking everything happening around the state budget and the federal budget around resources for public education. And so we're going to get to have a little bit of time with him to talk about what's happening around resources for summer programming that we can be tracking and thinking about for our planning. So Edgar, thank you for being with us this morning. We really, really appreciate your time. And I want to start with a question about just, what is going on with the state budget right now. If you could give us a little bit of context around the governor's budget proposal that came out in January and the particular budget exercise we're in right now, which is very different from the typical budget exercise that we go through. And then if you could segue from that specifically into explaining this $4.6 billion the governor proposed that includes resources for summer learning. So if you could just give us a little bit of background and speak to that.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Thanks to all of our everybody that is tuning in, just reading the chat and just seeing the diversity of the participants. It just goes to show what you've just been emphasizing, Jennifer, that this needs to be a collaborative effort, that it's not just, the traditional system or school districts or even just teachers. And, I just take solace in looking at that. And also on a personal aspect, hearing Dr. McCombs, hearing this conversation as a parent, right? Knowing just from that perspective, and I really appreciated just her suggestions, how practical they were, how specific they were. And just thank you to you folks. I know you guys have been a great partner to our folks around the state and really getting folks to think about being creative and being innovative. I know we partnered last year on a guide on summer learning for our members, which was well received. So just thanks for all your efforts there. To your question, yeah, so it's always tricky, you say, and I appreciate people just chiming in here in terms of being able to lean into this conversation. We're talking about policy and finance. Sometimes it's easy to just have all our eyes roll, right? I live this stuff on a day-to-day basis, and it's hard not to just get overwhelmed, especially right now. This is the issue of the day in terms of the budget and this whole conversation of school reopening. And I'm going to put reopening in quotations, I know that I have some of my own members on this webinar. They're quick to call us out on this. Schools have been open, right? It's not that schools haven't been open. There has been instruction, just regardless of where on the continuum of in-person instruction you're at. Schools, educators have been providing services. So schools are open. Now, the question is, how do we quickly get as many kids as possible into in-person learning and in-person opportunities as fast as we can, given all the science that we've seen, given everything that, that we know the benefits from getting kids in front of not only teachers, but amongst their peers. I loved your video about really, as a parent, reminding all the other aspects that, frankly, my kids aren't benefiting from right now, just because of the challenges, right, with the constraints of distance learning. But with that said, all you have to do is pick up the newspaper on a daily basis to know that this is kind of the fight right now, in terms of this bigger conversation about what is going to be the role of the state in terms of incentivizing or compelling more districts to in-person instruction. And what's kind of happening here, and this is really moved really quickly over the last month, that we see some momentum already happening, right? Just because I think the COVID situation is changing pretty dramatically and quickly. We do have more LEAs that are starting to either announce dates for return or at least putting plans out there. So we are starting to see some movement there. There's still this big, huge political conversation in terms of what is going to be the state's role here. And kind of where the highlight of this budget, as you mentioned, Jennifer, that this is a different type of year in terms of how the state is proposing to do things. They still believe that there is a role of the state to try to push folks along, because there's been frustration. Frankly, I think a lot of us feel this as parents, or it just in your respective communities, this notion that maybe some communities aren't moving as quick as they could be or should be. And then that's a very complex conversation on why in some communities maybe schools haven't reopened. Obviously, our perspective at AXA has been that, yeah, we need to prioritize in-person learning as much as possible, obviously with the caveat when it's safe to do so. And I know that's a dangerous word too, because the whole when it's safe to do so becomes a political conversation in itself. But I think this brings us back to what the state proposed this year, that they we're so quick to talk about bad news, right? And those of us that do advocacy, we're great at picking apart, the things that the state puts out and say, like, here are the issues. Let's start with a positive note. The budget was way better than any of us thought it was going to be. You would ask me at this time, last May, when the governor actually proposed a budget that was looking at huge drastic cuts to schools, to programs that I know many of the participants on this webinar really rely on ways to access after school resources. So there was drastic cuts that were gonna hit everybody pretty hard. And I think two things happened. One, I think the education community, and I'm gonna use education as a bigger umbrella, the broader community represented here, I think spoke up in terms of, yes, we get that there's a lot of uncertainty, but this is not the time to take away resources from the youth and from our educators who desperately need it, given the circumstances that we have before us. And then two, and I think the state will admit this, they kind of got it wrong when they were being a little too conservative in terms of what money they thought was going to come out. So all that to say is the news this year, it was way better than what we thought. And specifically in two pots that I think are of specific note to the folks on here is the governor proposed, legislature has to vote on it, and that's what we're dealing with at the moment, but the governor proposed two pretty big buckets of money. $2 billion that was intended to re-incentivize school districts that are going to move to in-person instruction, and this bigger pot of money, this $4.6 billion that's intended to, we're calling it a learning recovery grant, right? And it's pretty flexible, and we'll get into specifically what that looks like. But I think what's key for these two pots of money, different than what would happen in most years, is there's this big push, both from the governor, I would say from the legislature. One of the few things they do agree on at the moment is that this money should be enacted as quickly as possible. Because one of the lessons we learned even from last year, this last school year, when we were having this conversation of getting supports out to our communities, that if you don't make decisions here early on, then we're going to miss the window. Folks, our districts can't plan for that. They can't do the work to start partnering and connecting with the community resources. So kind of the main objective, aside from like the particulars of what this dollars are going to be used for, it's making sure that decisions are done early. Usually none of this would get voted on until May. They're in the midst right now of debating, trying to get something done with the ultimate goal of making decisions. That way folks can start planning for these dollars and setting up programs for the summer.
Let me ask a follow-up question to that on timing. So the debate about this early action budget that is being negotiated right now with this $4.6 billion, which folks can draw from to run summer programs, I think in bigger ways than we've probably ever seen. The negotiation for that is going on for a longer period of time than anybody expected. And I think people are really feeling anxious about when are we going to know? Mm-hmm. And my question for you is, what advice do you have for folks who are eager to begin to plan? And, how certain are we about the level of resources and resources coming early so that people can have the freedom to begin to plan, because we're already short on time. So what advice do you have for people about that?
It's a great question, because here's the unfortunate part of how this political conversation, policy conversation has played out. The $4.6 billion that I referenced, this learning recovery grant, and let me say a little bit about what that can be used for. It's intended to be for things like summer learning, professional development, some of the things you and Dr. McCombs were talking about, this social emotional piece. And those dollars are intended to be pretty flexible. That it's, yes, they're going to go to districts, but the idea there is that districts can partner with other community organizations to think about how to use those dollars. And there's a big emphasis, there's the big emphasis on also start to use these dollars in the summer. There's a big window of when you can actually use them. You don't actually have to expend them all till next year, but the intent is that these start being used this summer. So here's the problem. This bigger pot, which I think it'd be of the biggest interest to the folks on this call, is being wrapped up with this other piece on the $2 billion that has to do with reopening. And that's an incentive for those LEAs that are opening, and there's more parameters around those dollars. And this is what's getting caught up in the discussion about how much COVID testing do you have to do? What are going to be the requirements around collective bargaining? I will say that on the summer learning recovery piece, these dollars that can be accessed for all the things we're talking about today, there's pretty broad support for that. There's really nobody taking issue about, let's get these dollars out. Let's make them as flexible as possible. Let's make some decisions. The unfortunate part, it's being tied up in this bigger conversation. Now, the optimist in me will say to your question, it's going to get done. It's going to get done. And while the other pot of money may look a little different on what conditions, what will LEAs have to do to access those dollars, I think this bigger pot that's really intended for summer learning, for professional development, for really being creative. One piece I don't think I mentioned is that it's really into 85% of these dollars have to be for in-person services. So that's one of the pieces that's really key to this, that the intent here is that this is for in-person learning in the broader sense. All the things we've talked about would be eligible for those funds. Schools are going to get those dollars. Our community, those are going to go out. It's now a question of how long is this going to drag out, but there's pretty broad support. So to your question, I think it's pretty safe for communities, especially for our leaders, for our district leaders, to start assuming that you're going to get those dollars. I know that we usually don't say that, right? In the education world, we have a knack for always that we don't have enough resources. And not to say that we have enough resources to meet all the needs now, but there's going to be significant amount of money that's going to be going to LEAs here this year for some of these intended purposes. So even though there hasn't been final action, especially on this piece of what am I going to offer this summer, what can I start thinking about that? I think it's probably prudent for our leaders to really assume those dollars will be there, at least for this piece of it. The other piece about what dollars you're going to get based on whether you're reopened or not, that's a little bit more questionable. This piece is going to be there when all is said and done.
Okay, thank you. I think that's super helpful for people to hear because there's a big job in front of us around hiring, planning, and all the pieces that need to be put in place for summer. So I want to repeat what Edgar just said, start planning now. The money's going to be there. We don't know exactly when the checks are going to drop, but it's pretty safe bet that money is going to be there. You mentioned that the ways in which LEAs can spend that $4.6 billion is going to be pretty flexible, but there will be some parameters based on what you're seeing in the bill. What are some of the parameters you do expect to see so people are aware for their planning?
Yeah, I think it's important. Sacramento does not believe in giving money with absolutely no strings attached, right? So, and probably for a good reason. I think from an accountability standpoint, I think we would agree that there should be some broad guardrails there. At the end of the day, let those closest to the students maybe make some of the decisions of what a specific community actually needs. But I think it's fair as a policymaker, they need to make sure that these dollars are going to meet its intended purpose. So the key parameters are this piece that most of those dollars do have to be spent. Namely, 85% of those dollars have to be spent on in-person services. This is different than some of the dollars that the system got last year. While most of the districts were in distance learning, those dollars were allowed to be used on remediation or other supports, even while kids were in distance learning. So that's a key difference, that this is really focused on in-person services. And I think the other key parameter is similar to most of these big streams of funding that the state will put out, is that they want to focus on the neediest kids. So low-income students, English learners, homeless youth, students with disabilities. There's going to be language there that asks to put a priority on those students. It'll still be flexible in terms of how it goes out. They're using the LCFF formula for some of the distribution there, which I think our system has gotten pretty familiar with. So there's that equity component on how these dollars are going to go out. Now, I should point out, while most of this is positive, I will point out one piece that it does concern us a little bit. One of the few things that concerns us about this bigger $4.6 billion in this latest draft that the legislature put out a few days ago, they did call that 10% of all the funds that an LEA would get had to be used for paraprofessionals. So we have a concern there, not because of the intent there of obviously paraprofessionals serve a great need in our system. We are more concerned about, and this is, look, we beat this drum all the time, that the state shouldn't be telling districts at that level how to spend dollars without having any local context about their personnel needs, about what needs are there. So that's kind of our only concern on that part of it. We think it limits flexibility. I mean, you and Dr. McCombs were talking about the challenges of staffing. We have rural areas in the state that can't find paraprofessionals. So in order to like force these folks to either go and hire them and or retain them, we just don't think makes sense. And frankly, I think the more flexibility we have on those dollars, it give more leeway to folks to be creative on how do we best serve those needs.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really, really important point. One other thing I just want to quickly mention, I think it's important for people to understand about what we've seen in the proposal around the money, is that the money can be used through September of 2022. So we have the space of 2 summers, which I think is incredibly important to keep in mind for planning. And we're absolutely going to need all that time for the recovery in front of us. And one thing that we didn't get to with Jennifer on the research, but the research on summer learning is very clear that at least 2 summers are needed in order to really make gains on both the academic and the social emotional wellness outcomes for young people. So I wanted to throw that in. But I want to move us for a moment to the federal budget piece, which is also on people's minds right now. So the federal government is currently debating this education stimulus package. And what do you expect to see in this pot of money that applies to summer programming, and how do you see it complementing or leveraging our state investment?
Yeah, I think there's more good news. I mean, and usually when we talk about funding and education, it's, again, we have a tendency to just like, we're not getting enough. And again, I've yet to meet a school leader, educator that feels, yes, we have every resource needed to effectively serve our students. With that said, I do think that there's opportunities here in this upcoming year. And with the federal government on top of what they've already provided, through this ESSER funds and some of these other COVID relief funds that the state has already started to benefit, there is this other pot of money that they're proposing, kind of in the similar vein, to be very flexible. And summer learning or accelerated learning or supplemental services is at the heart of those discussions. I think, again, on the politics now in DC is the Biden administration, this is a priority for them. I think we're going to see resources. If there's any question, it's about what level, like what's that final number going to be. But again, kind of the same along the same lines, there's going to be more dollars coming from the federal government on top of the state piece that folks can benefit from. Now, the one bit of concern, I guess, that we would have on the federal dollars, because if I take a too positive note, I know I'm going to have somebody say, oh, wait a minute, in our community, we may not see as many of these dollars for namely one reason. These are going to be put out by Title I funds. And so obviously the goal of Title I is to serve the neediest students. And so we think that that's appropriate in terms of an equity aspect. But, and there's always a but, there's some communities, again, looking, and I know I saw a couple of questions about rural communities. There's some schools just because of their size or in their areas that don't access Title I funds. There's still a huge need there, and they wouldn't get those dollars. So that makes actually the state dollars that much more important in terms of leveraging, making sure that we still are supporting those, acknowledging that the federal government and some of the monies that may come down from them may not hit all those targeted populations that we need. But I think it's the same story here, that there's going to be more resources coming from the federal government, similar strategy that the state's taking, making them flexible, really aimed at this broader piece about recovery, summer learning. Oh, one thing that I forgot to mention that I think is important, about really thinking, and this is a message really to our leaders and to our school district leaders, that given some of the challenges that we face, and both you and Jennifer talked about this whole issue of educator burnout, or which is a real thing, right? I know our members are feeling it. I know our teachers are feeling it. So that piece of it's important to, if we're going to really think about collaboration, this is the year to do it. Even if the educators in your district are not, you may have challenges getting some of them that are into some of these programs. I think this is where it becomes more important to, how can I leverage these funds? How can I partner with some other community organizations that can help me serve this need? And the federal funding will have the same parameters, and you'll be eligible to do the same thing with those dollars.
We had a couple follow-up questions come in about the federal money on some of the specifics. Do you have a sense of when that federal money may be coming, and then how can LEAs find out like what's the formula that will happen through? How can LEAs find out how much they may be getting?
Yeah, the federal political process, similar to Sacramento, isn't always the quickest. So I think that's the piece. I think it's pretty certain that there will be final action. I think I would say that they're really pushing this. I mean, the Biden administration has a number of balls in the air right now, trying to get their cabinet confirmed, really trying to move along this piece. There was some conversation about trying to get a bipartisan effort. I think the Republicans had made clear that the final number was not something that they were super comfortable with. So there were some conversations about how do we ratchet that back a bit. But the Biden administration has made it clear, and as far as it looks like they have the political support. They have the votes, in other words, to push this forward. So I think this is going to come to fruition probably in the weeks to come. Now, the one caveat I'll give on this, I will speak with more certainty on the state dollars. You can look at that 4.6 billion and do that calculation about what your school district, what your community is going to get. You can do that on the federal dollars, but because that number could potentially change, I would look at those dollars with a little less certainty about, oh, we're going to get X. I think the bigger piece there is knowing that you're going to get dollars on top of what the state is already providing, and knowing that there's significant piece there. But I think because it is being at least talked about on a Title I allocation, that's the best way to determine kind of what the school district is potentially going to see with this new package.
Got it. Thank you. We are out of time for this segment. I knew that was going to all go by really fast, and we have some questions we didn't get to in both sections, but as I said in the beginning, we're capturing the questions, and we're going to be sure in our follow-up communications to answer all the questions that came up that we didn't have a chance to answer. So Edgar, thank you again for your time. It's really great to have you be with us today, and we're looking forward to continuing to collaborate with you as this adventure continues.
Thanks for having me.
So I really want to just thank again both of our panelists for their time with us today. And I also, again, want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. I know it was relatively short notice in putting this together. And also know this is an incredibly chaotic and difficult time for everybody working in the education world, whether you're on the school side, the community side, and we're trying to do everything we can to both listen and also develop resources and tools and information that will support you as you're planning forward for summer and beyond. We are going to be sending a recording of this session to everyone who registered for the webinar, and we will also be posting it to our website. As far as other resources for summer planning, there's a few things I wanted to mention. One is that we have launched a summer planning page on our website, so check that out for tools and resources. We're going to be updating that on a continual basis as more things come forward. We have also partnered with the National Summer Learning Association to create a summer planning guide for California, and that's going to be released sometime next week. So we'll be sending out an alert about that. Speaking of National Summer Learning Association, we also want to make sure everybody is aware that next week, every day next week, National Summer Learning Association is hosting some planning webinars that are very complementary as far as the topics to what we are providing here in California. So check that out. And finally, stay tuned for an announcement about the upcoming webinars that we're going to be hosting. As I said, we have a few of those topics mapped out, but we're very much looking forward to your feedback. And as we conclude, we would very much appreciate you answering just a few questions about this webinar and a place to give feedback about topics you would like to see presented in the next couple of months. And so in the chat, you will see a link to a very short survey, just a few questions. It'll just take you a minute. We would really, really appreciate if you would just take a moment to fill that out. Your input is really, really important. So with that, again, a big thank you for being with us this morning. And we will see you next time. Have a wonderful week, everyone.